It was the summer of 1966 in Greenwood, Mississippi, a town carved straight down the middle by segregation. Two sides divided not just by streets, but by laws, stairs, and the weight of a history that refused to loosen its grip. On a humid Saturday night, a small wooden nightclub tucked behind the railroad tracks pulsed with the sound of blues leaking from its open windows. The crowd inside was tight-packed, all black, all familiar with the unspoken rules of survival in a place where stepping into the wrong room could cost you your life. That night, the club's atmosphere felt different, charged, buzzing, because Stevie Wonder, only 16 and already rising like a comet, had agreed to stop by after his show in Jackson. Word spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, and people gathered shoulder to shoulder under the flickering neon sign, desperate for a moment of joy in a place that offered so little of it. Near the back of the room sat Caleb Turner, a 12-year-old blind black boy with a posture far too careful for someone his age. He wore a faded button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled neatly by his mother, and his hands rested on the table in front of him, gently tracing the grooves of its wooden surface. Caleb had been blind since birth, but he wasn't silent, not when he was alone. He sang while sweeping the porch. He hummed while walking to the well. He whispered melodies under the covers at night so he wouldn't wake his younger siblings, but in public, he never dared lift his voice above a murmur. In Greenwood, every black child learned early that attention was dangerous, so Caleb kept his voice tucked away like something too precious to risk. Still, sitting in that club, packed between neighbors and distant cousins, he felt the music vibrating through the floorboards, stirring something inside him he had never felt before, something brave, something loud, something impossible to hold back. Stevie walked into the club to a wave of cheers so loud it shook dust from the rafters, but the joy in the room dimmed only slightly beneath the reality outside its doors. Mississippi was dangerous ground. Every black gathering carried risk, and yet, in that cramped room, lit by a few dim bulbs and the glow of sweat on dancing faces, people allowed themselves to breathe. Stevie sat at the upright piano, stretching his hands over the keys, ready to bless the room with one more song before heading out. But before he played a single note, he paused, head tilted, eyebrows raised, as if he'd heard something no one else caught. He turned toward the back of the club, toward the corner where Caleb sat frozen, his hands hovering mid-air as his quiet humming escaped without permission. Stevie smiled slowly, the kind of smile that saw straight into the soul. "Little brother in the back," he said, raising his voice above the hush that fell. "Come sing that for me." Gasps rippled through the room. Caleb's heart stopped, and in a segregated Mississippi nightclub, a moment began that no one would ever forget. Caleb froze in place, his fingers curling against the edge of the table as if he could anchor himself to the wood. Conversations died instantly. Chairs stopped creaking. Even the ceiling fan seemed to quiet as every eye in the room turned toward the small boy in the corner. "Caleb," his mother whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for his arm. She wasn't scolding. She was afraid. Afraid of attention. Afraid of what could happen if the wrong person heard her son being seen in a world that punished black children for shining too brightly. But Stevie's voice had already drifted through the club, warm and certain, like a hand extended in the dark. "Come on, little brother," he said again, tapping the microphone lightly. "Let us hear you." The crowd murmured in disbelief. A few older men shook their heads, whispering, "Boy's too shy. He won't do it." Others leaned forward, silently begging him to try. Caleb's heart thundered in his chest, and for a moment he wished he could melt into the wooden floorboards beneath his feet. Slowly, his mother guided him to stand, her hand trembling as she placed it on his back. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, though her voice cracked with fear and pride tangled tightly together. Caleb stood barefoot on the dusty floor, his small body shaking as he tried to understand why Stevie Wonder had heard him at all. The club parted like water as neighbors stepped aside, creating a narrow path leading to the stage. Caleb took one hesitant step, then another, his hand sliding along the back of a chair until it found empty air. Someone offered their arm. Then another hand reached out. The room became a chain of support, guiding him gently forward. He didn't see their faces, but he felt the warmth of their palms, the quiet encouragement in their breaths, the hope rising in the room, like steam in the summer heat. When Caleb reached the front of the room, Stevie stepped down from the tiny wooden stage and knelt beside him, meeting the boy at his height. "You brave for coming up here," Stevie said softly, placing a steady hand on Caleb's shoulder. The boy's breath hitched, his throat tight. He'd never been spoken to like that, never been praised for anything but staying out of trouble. Stevie lifted the microphone and held it toward him, not pushing, not rushing, offering it the way someone offers a fragile gift. The room held its breath again. Caleb opened his mouth, but the first attempt at sound dissolved into nothing more than a shaky exhale. Someone in the back whispered, "It's all right, baby." Another voice followed, "Take your time." Stevie nodded gently. "Just breathe," he said. "Let the music do the work." And with the entire club suspended in silence, Caleb Turner inhaled, steadying himself for the moment that would change everything. Caleb took one trembling breath, the kind that shook his whole chest, the kind that felt like it might collapse before it ever turned into sound. The microphone waited only inches from his lips, but to him it felt miles away, like a mountain he wasn't sure he could climb. The heat of the club pressed against his skin, thick and heavy, carrying the scent of sweat, wooden floors, and fried catfish drifting in from the kitchen. For a moment, he thought his knees might give out. He wasn't used to being watched. He wasn't used to being wanted. But then he felt Stevie's hand on his shoulder, warm, steady, grounding, like an anchor keeping him from drifting away. That touch, combined with the hush of the crowd leaning into him instead of away, gave Caleb just enough courage to lift his chin slightly. He couldn't see their faces. He couldn't see the fear in his mother's eyes or the awe in the faces of the neighbors. He could only hear their breath, their hope, their silence. And somewhere inside that silence, something opened. The first sound that escaped him wasn't a word, wasn't a note, just a soft, broken hum, barely audible over the hum of the single cracked speaker hanging from the ceiling. But it was enough to shift the entire room. Men who had lived through decades of pain straightened in their chairs. Women held their breath, hands pressed to their hearts. The hum was shaky, fragile, but it carried a depth no one expected from a boy who had spent his whole life shrinking into corners. Stevie smiled, slow and proud, tilting the microphone closer. "That's it, little brother," he whispered. Caleb tried again. The second hum was stronger, fuller, shaped by a soul that had been waiting in the dark for a chance to be heard. He felt the vibration travel through his throat, down his chest, into the dusty floorboards beneath his bare feet. For the first time, his own voice didn't feel like something dangerous. It felt like something alive. Then Caleb opened his mouth fully, and the note that poured out silenced the entire club as if someone had cut the power. His voice wasn't loud, but it was rich, trembling with a depth that didn't belong to a 12-year-old child. It was soaked in church mornings and porch evenings, in whispered dreams and lived sorrow. It sounded like the Mississippi Delta itself had reached up through his small body to speak. Conversations died. Glasses were lowered, mid-sip. A man at the bar let out a soft, stunned curse as tears filled his eyes. What had been a humid, noisy juke joint only seconds earlier transformed into a sacred space. The note quivered once, then steadied, stretching through the air with a clarity that demanded reverence. And in that tiny, segregated club, surrounded by danger outside its doors and hope inside its walls, Caleb Turner finally let the world hear the voice he'd been hiding his whole life. The moment Caleb's note settled into the thick Mississippi air, something inside the room shifted, something spiritual, something electric, something ancient. His voice carried a weight that didn't match the size of the boy it came from. It was raspy, yet smooth, young, yet weathered, trembling, yet undeniably powerful. It sounded like Sunday morning hymns carried across cotton fields, like whispered prayers spoken in the dark, like the voices of elders who had lived long enough to bury their pain beneath gospel songs. People stared at him as if, witnessing a miracle. A woman near the front pressed her hands together and whispered, "Lord, that baby's got an old soul." The band members, local men who'd been playing blues for decades, froze completely, their instruments suspended in their hands. One of them wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his shirt, muttering, "That ain't no child's voice. That's heaven speaking through him." Stevie stepped back slowly, the smile on his face stretching wide as pride and disbelief flickered across his expression. He tilted his head like he was listening to the boy's voice echo inside his own chest. Caleb didn't see any of it. He sang with his chin lifted slightly, eyes unfocused, hands clasped together in front of him as if clinging to the sound itself. His voice wavered once, just once, as fear tried to slither back into his throat, but the crowd, sensing that moment of uncertainty, breathed a soft hum of encouragement. It wasn't loud, not even unified, but it felt like the room wrapped its arms around him, and that was all he needed. Caleb continued, releasing a deeper, fuller note that rolled through the club like thunder rumbling in the distance. The acoustics weren't good. The ceiling was low, the boards were worn, the speakers crackled, but none of it mattered. His voice filled every inch of the space. The entire club leaned in closer, unified by something greater than music. In that instant, the room wasn't just listening, they were witnessing a child who had never been allowed to fully exist, finally stepping into himself. The bartender, a tall man with stern eyes, reached blindly for a towel, wiping tears he pretended were sweat. Even the cook in the doorway, still wearing his apron, stood frozen with a tray in his hands, his mouth hanging open. Caleb's mother pressed both hands over her heart, her body trembling as tears streamed down her cheeks. She had known her son's voice was beautiful, but she had never heard him release it with this kind of truth, this kind of bravery. And as Caleb held the last vibrating edge of his note, the room fell impossibly silent, not because they lacked words, but because nothing felt worthy of being spoken in the presence of what they'd just heard. As the final edge of Caleb's note dissolved into the humid air, the silence that followed felt holy, thick, breathless, and trembling. No one moved. No one dared blink. It was as if the entire club had been pulled into a shared heartbeat, suspended between disbelief and awe. Caleb stood in the center of that quiet, his small hands clasped tightly, his chest rising and falling in fast, shallow breaths. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing against his skin, but instead of fear, something else bloomed inside him now. Something warm, something freeing. He had never heard applause directed at him before, not real applause, not the kind that wasn't pity or politeness. He didn't know if he deserved this moment. He didn't know if it was safe to accept it, but the stillness in the room didn't feel dangerous. It felt like the world holding its breath for him, waiting to see if he would keep going. And somehow, despite the tremor in his knees, Caleb knew he could. Stevie stepped forward slowly, careful not to break the atmosphere that felt too fragile to touch. He lowered himself to one knee beside Caleb, his face full of reverence, true reverence, the kind reserved for talent that speaks from a place deeper than technique or training. "Brother," he said softly into the microphone, voice thick with emotion, "sing another one." The request was simple, but the power behind it shook the room. People gasped. A few whispered prayers. Caleb's mother covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Stevie didn't look at the crowd. He kept his attention on the boy, speaking to him with a gentleness that wrapped around Caleb like a blanket. "Don't be afraid," Stevie whispered. "Your voice is already doing God's work." Those words burrowed deep. Caleb swallowed hard, nodding slowly as he turned his face back toward the microphone. He didn't see Stevie's proud smile. He didn't see the audience lean forward again. But he felt it, every ounce of faith rising toward him like warm air. Caleb inhaled, deeper this time, and released a second note, low, slow, vulnerable. The sound wavered at first, trembling like a leaf in a storm, but as he continued, something unlocked inside him. The note expanded, broadened, rich with emotion he didn't know he had the right to express. A soft cry escaped someone in the back. Another person shouted, "Sing, child!" The band members exchanged stunned glances, their eyes shining. The guitarist lifted his instrument, but slowly lowered it again, unwilling to interrupt the purity of the boy's voice. The piano player pressed a single quiet chord underneath Caleb, a tender anchor instead of a lead, and Caleb responded instinctively, shifting his tone to match without hesitation. He didn't think, didn't plan, didn't calculate. He simply felt, and in that moment, his voice grew into something that didn't belong to a timid 12-year-old boy from a segregated Mississippi town. It belonged to something ancient, something unstoppable, something free. Caleb's second note melted into a long, trembling run that slid through the room with a warmth so powerful it made grown men fold into themselves. The club had heard great singers before, church soloists, traveling blues talents, elders whose voices carried decades of grief and glory, but nothing like this. Nothing with this purity, nothing with this truth. Caleb's small body swayed gently, instinctively, as though the music itself were guiding him. He didn't know the technical terms for what he was doing. He didn't know he was bending notes with the precision of seasoned soul legends or holding vibrato with flawless control. He only knew that, for the first time in his life, his voice wasn't something to hide. It wasn't something dangerous. It was something strong, so strong it felt like it was lifting him off the ground. As he sang, the darkness behind his eyelids became a canvas where the music painted shapes he could feel but not see. Warm curves, rising waves, bursts of light that made him feel bigger than the room he stood in. Stevie felt the shift too. He watched the boy with an expression that blended awe, pride, and something close to disbelief. This wasn't just talent. This was destiny. This was a sound the world had been waiting to hear without knowing it. Stevie stepped back again, another foot, then another, giving Caleb the entire front of the stage, as though crowning him. The audience followed Stevie's lead, recognizing the magnitude of what they were witnessing. People began to stand, slowly at first, then in a wave, until the entire club was on its feet. Some lifted their hands like they were in church, others pressed them over their hearts, tears streaming down their cheeks. Caleb, unaware of the standing ovation around him, continued singing with his face tilted upward, as if reaching for something beyond the ceiling of that dimly lit room. The piano player, hands shaking, added a few soft chords beneath him, then immediately backed away again, unable to risk overshadowing what felt like a once-in-a-lifetime moment. When Caleb reached the final note, his voice didn't crash or falter. It soared. It climbed into a place so high and so hauntingly beautiful that a woman near the front collapsed into her chair, overwhelmed. A man in the corner, usually stone-faced, wiped his eyes with both hands. Even the cook in the doorway whispered, "Dear God," under his breath. The note held the room hostage in the most beautiful way possible, stretching into a silence so profound it felt like the whole town had stopped, breathing. And when it finally faded, the room didn't erupt. Not yet. Instead, it blossomed into a soft, trembling awe. People stood frozen, staring at the boy who had just poured out a voice that could crack open stone. Caleb lowered his chin slowly, his breath unsteady, his hands shaking. He didn't know what he had done. He only knew he had spoken in the only language the world had ever let him keep. And now, the room was ready to answer. The silence after Caleb's final note was so complete it felt unreal, like the world itself had paused, afraid to break whatever sacred thing he had created. Caleb stood trembling, clutching the microphone with both hands, his small chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven breaths. He didn't know if the room liked it. He didn't know if he'd sung too long, too loud, too raw. Blindness shielded him from the sight of hundreds of stunned faces staring up at him with awe so deep it bordered on reverence. All he had to guide him now was the silence, and for a heartbeat he thought he'd failed. But then someone in the back whispered, voice thick with emotion, "Praise God." And suddenly the room erupted. It wasn't applause at first. It was shouting. It was crying. It was chairs scraping back as the entire club rose to its feet in an explosion of sound so fierce it rattled the windows. Women fanned themselves desperately, tears streaming down their faces. Men covered their mouths to hold in sobs that shook their shoulders. A chorus of voices surged forward. "Sing it, baby! That boy is anointed! Lord have mercy!" see. The eruption was so overwhelming that Caleb stumbled back in fear, unsure if he had done something wrong. But Stevie moved instantly, catching him with a gentle hand on his back. "They're not mad," Stevie whispered softly, leaning close. "They're moved." Caleb swallowed hard, tears filling his unseeing eyes. Moved because of him, because of his voice, something he had been told to. Quiet his whole life? Stevie lifted Caleb's hand high into the air, and the crowd doubled in volume, roaring with a force that shook the walls of the old club. "Remember this name," Stevie called out, his voice booming with pride. "Caleb Turner!" The applause thundered, rolling like a storm hitting the delta. Caleb's mother pressed both hands over her face, sobbing uncontrollably as family members wrapped their arms around her. The boy turned toward the sound of his mother's cries, overwhelmed, unsure how to process the love pouring toward him. Stevie bent down and whispered into Caleb's ear, "The world is going to hear you, little brother. Tonight was just the beginning." Those words struck Caleb with the force of a revelation. For the first time, he believed them, and as the crowd continued to roar his name, the little blind boy from a segregated Mississippi town stood taller than he ever had, bathed in a spotlight he couldn't see, but one he had earned with a voice powerful enough to silence a room and shake its soul. Long after the crowd trickled out into the warm Mississippi night, the little wooden club behind the railroad tracks still pulsed with the memory of Caleb's voice. The floorboards vibrated softly beneath the feet of the last lingering patrons, as though the echoes of his song had sunk into the wood itself. Musicians who had played in juke joints their entire lives stood together in a quiet circle, shaking their heads, wiping, their eyes whispering, that boy is something else." The bartender leaned against the counter long after his shift ended, staring at the empty stage with a look that blended disbelief and reverence. Even the cook, usually the first to clock out, found himself frozen in the doorway, apron still tied, feeling the weight of what he had just witnessed. It wasn't just a performance. It was a moment that rewrote the room. Outside, Caleb clung to his mother's hand as they walked down the dusty road toward home, his bare feet brushing against warm dirt. She didn't speak, not right away. Her breath kept catching in her throat, the night air too thick with pride and fear and awe for words. Caleb felt the tremor in her hand and finally whispered, "Mama, was it all right?" She stopped walking, pulling him gently against her chest as tears streamed down her cheeks. "All right," she whispered, pressing her hand to the back of his head. "Baby, you shook that whole room. You made them feel something." Caleb didn't know how to respond. The world was still a blur of darkness, but for the first time he felt like he could sense his future, warm, glowing, powerful, stretching out ahead of him in a way he had never imagined. The boy who had been taught to be small now felt something swelling inside him, possibility. Back inside the dimming club, Stevie remained on stage alone, running his fingers over the keys of the beat-up upright piano. He wasn't playing, just feeling the quiet hum of the room, as though testing the air for the last remnants of Caleb's voice. A slow smile formed on his face. "He's got it," Stevie murmured to himself. "The world's gonna know his name." He tapped one soft chord, just one, letting the note drift into the empty space like a blessing, because he understood something no one else in the room had fully realized yet. Voices like Caleb's didn't belong to one small town. They belonged to history. They belonged to the world. And as the final echoes finally dissolved into the thick Mississippi night, Stevie Wonder whispered a truth that would follow Caleb Turner for the rest of his life. This is only the beginning.